Hi, I'm Zach Singerman, and welcome to the Gen Z Jews Learning from Leaders series. In this series, I am interviewing national leaders on the topics of anti-Semitism, Israel, and leadership. Today, our guest is Blond. Miss Blond is the executive director of the Capital Jewish Museum. She was previously the director of exhibitions at the Smithsonian Museum of Natural History. Miss Blond, thank you for being here today.
Thanks for inviting me.
So, could you give an overview of the museum and what you do there?
Yes. So we are building the new Lillian and Albert Small Capital Jewish Museum in downtown Washington. It is just a block from the National Building Museum, and it's going to combine a historic site, the first synagogue that was built in Washington, D.C., with a new museum facility. So we'll have new exhibition galleries, new programming spaces, and we've spent the last few years planning what those exhibitions will be, what kind of objects we'll feature, what kind of interactive experiences we'll have for visitors, what kind of stories we want to tell in the museum. And it's really, like the first Jewish museum for the nation's capital. There's so many cities really around the world that have Jewish museums to talk about Jewish history, life, and culture for Jewish and also for non-Jewish audiences. And so we're excited to have that finally in our nation's capital, to welcome, all sorts of people from this really big tourist city into our new museum. And my job is a little bit of everything. As the director of the museum, I've been involved with fundraising in support of the museum, thinking about the branding, kind of like what is this new museum going to be? What's the vision for the museum? Thinking about exhibition planning, about architectural design, kind of all the pieces that have to come together to make this thing real. So, definitely wear lots of hats.
And how is this museum different than a Jewish museum in an urban area like New York that has a lot of specific Jewish neighborhoods?
Yeah, so I guess there are a couple different answers to that question. So New York itself has a few different Jewish museums. The Jewish Museum in New York is actually an art museum. There's also a Holocaust museum and a Jewish Children's Museum in Brooklyn. So we'll be very different from those just because of the content, the stories that we're trying to tell. But obviously, New York, this story of the Jewish community in New York looks really different than the story of Washington's Jewish community. Kind of the New York story is about it's the one that we all know, right? It's the first wave of immigrants to America came through Ellis Island. They came to a lot of the big port cities in America. So New York and Baltimore, which is close to here, Charleston, kind of up and down the East Coast. And those are the earliest Jewish stories. They're usually people who come with very little money, with very little English, and live kind of in enclaves. You describe them as, like in tight-knit neighborhoods. By the time those immigrants come to Washington as emigrants, they are generally have a little bit more money. They have a little bit more, they're a little bit more assimilated into U.S. culture. And so they start here and they really spread out across the whole city. So we have early Jewish life in all four quadrants of Washington. And they're a little bit more enmeshed into the neighborhoods that they live in, living and working with other cultural communities in the city. And there are lots of examples. There are some early peddlers, but business owners really early on, and kind of creating social services. Some of the stories are similar, but Washington's looks a little bit different. And it's also, starts a little later because Washington starts a little later. We don't become the capital of the country until the late 1700s. And then it's not really till after the Civil War when Washington really starts its growth. And so you kind of see the same pattern with the Jewish community here.
Mm-hmm. And so what's the main focus of the collection at the museum?
So I'm going to kind of distinguish between two things. So the main focus of the museum, we really are focused on, because we're downtown in the nation's capital, we're talking about stories of sort of how the nation's capital shaped the Jewish community here, and how Jews in Washington shaped the city, but also our country, and the world, writ large, because of being here in the capital city. The collection it's a great question, because the collection is the outgrowth of the Jewish Historical Society, which we are kind of the next iteration of the Jewish Historical Society, which was formed in Washington back in the 60s. And it represents all kinds of stories of family, of community, of place in Washington's Jewish story. And so we have some of those early immigrant objects that families brought with them when they came to Washington. But then we also have lots of examples of sort of modern Jewish activism, or synagogues and community organizations. And now we're really focused on growing out the collection in the more national and international scale. So we're trying to represent some of the stories of big players in federal government, in the Supreme Court, and lawyering and lobbying, and trying to kind of flesh out some of those stories, which we didn't have as much of early on in the collection, but we're getting some great examples of fun additions to the collection, some of which will be on exhibit in the new museum when we open.
And recently, you guys moved the Addis Israel Synagogue, or the original Addis Israel Synagogue, and that's going to be part of the new museum. Why is it important for the museum to be housed in this historic synagogue for DC?
Do you mind if I share my screen? Maybe I can show you a few pictures. It'll kind of, can you enable that?
Yeah.
If it's a problem, I can skip it too, but it gives you a little bit of there. Great. So this is that little building that you were referencing. It's the first synagogue that was built in Washington, D.C., as the original Addis Israel. So the first congregation in Washington is Washington Hebrew. They were formed early on, and then a group of families felt that Washington Hebrew's traditions were getting a little bit too flexible and reform, and organ was brought into the sanctuary, and that threw people off. And so a group of 30 families broke off from Washington Hebrew and formed their own congregation, and they built this synagogue as the first that was built in Washington, D.C. And it was built in 1876, and Ulysses Grant was at the dedication ceremony for this little building after the Civil War. It's kind of a great early Washington story. You can see the National Building Museum in the background here, which was the pension building. As people came back from the Civil War, they were able to collect their pensions, and this is this little neighborhood now off of Judiciary Square. And you can see that they built this little building in the shadow of the Capitol, which is just 10 blocks away from here. And I think really this was, yes, it was kind of a statement of community, but it was also a statement that Jews had found a home in the nation's capital. And I don't think it was any coincidence that they decided to build this building just down the street from the growing kind of federal city capital downtown. And after 30 years, they outgrew the building. They moved and built this grand synagogue at 6th and I, which I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with, this space which was Jewish, and then later, a number of other uses of the building, and has now come back to be a center for Jewish life and culture. And the original Addis building became all sorts of other things. It was a bike shop. It was a coffee store. It was a series of churches. It was even a barbecue restaurant with this little pig hanging off the side of the historic synagogue, which I just love that image. And then in the 60s, it was at threat of demolition because Metro was building its headquarters downtown. And so a group of families raised enough money to literally pick up the building back in 1969 and drive it down the street and park it on a new plot of land that the city gave to the Jewish Historical Society. And they've been, running traveling exhibitions and programs out of this historic building, which was kind of restored. And a number of years ago, this whole neighborhood really was the focus of a big redevelopment project where they've actually decked over the highway, which runs through the city, this part of the city. And the Capitol Jewish Museum, will be kind of the core cultural component of this renovated, rejuvenated part of the city, just a block from the building museum. And so you referenced this building move from a couple of years ago, which was this crazy day where they picked up the building on these steel beams and 90 wheels under it and drove it with remote control down the street to its new home. And so for me, I think taking this like great urban story, like it's a Jewish story, but it's also just a city story, and putting it at the heart of the museum is really important because it kind of connects the old to the new. It connects the community to its roots. I think like there are lots of sort of metaphoric ways that it's fun, but it's also great to have this like a literal landmark space that will be part of the museum experience. There's something special about being in a building that was built at our country's centennial, almost 150 years ago. It's just kind of got like just like a little cool factor to being in that kind of a space. So I think it's special in lots of ways.
Definitely. It's like, it seems like it's going to be a great museum.
Yeah, we're super excited.
So how do you think the museum is important to non-Jewish Washington and that community?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really good question. We definitely think about the museum as being both for Jewish and non-Jewish audiences. Washington's like a huge tourist city. And while we have the Holocaust Museum here, which tells an incredibly important story, there's not really a public story of Jewish life and culture in the nation's capital. And so with kind of all these examples of anti-Semitism and misconceptions about what it means to be Jewish and what Jewish religion and practice looks like, I think this is an opportunity to talk to non-Jewish audiences and dispel some of those myths. We think about all these like congressmen and interns that come to Washington from districts that have like just a tiny fraction of Jewish families, and to be able to talk about Jewish life and give them a common framework, a common understanding, a common language, we think is really important. And so and we also kind of think of this as an opportunity for encouraging our visitors to think about their own impact in their communities, whether they're Jews or not Jews. Our mission is connect, reflect, act. So like connecting people from different cultures together, reflecting on how the past is relevant to all of the issues that we're wrestling with today, and acting on behalf of your values and your community. And I think that's relevant whether you're Jewish or not Jewish. Like, how do you want to show up in your community, and what issues are meaningful enough to you that you want to find ways to bring change or to stand up on behalf of. And so we want the museum to be able to do that for Jewish families here, but we also think that that mission is universal enough that it applies to anybody who comes through the door.
So how do you envision the Jewish community really taking part in this museum?
Well, we certainly hope they all come and come frequently. We talk about school groups and making sure that we have programming for Jewish day schools and religious schools in the museum space to come, in certain grades annually. We're going to have amazing programming for teens in our we'll have this community action lab, which is really focused on kind of the tools of change making. And you're part of our teen council now, and we're excited to have teens as leaders in the museum, sort of interpreting content, telling stories in the exhibition galleries, helping to lead some of our programs. And it will be both just a museum space, an exhibition space, but also, we'll have like fun general programming too, where we can invite people in for happy hours and for mahjong and yoga on our rooftop terrace and like just stuff that would be that will make it feel like a community space too. And of course, being able to like host a bar mitzvah in the museum or another celebration, which would be really cool. So we really want it to be a community space, and we've created exhibitions that like ask people to literally move and touch and organize and take pictures so that you are part of shaping the exhibit experience in addition to just coming and learning about this city's story.
And is there anything else that you would like to say to the Gen Z community to wrap up?
I just can't wait to invite you into the museum. We're planning to open our doors in 2022. So probably we're keeping our fingers crossed for fall, like a September 22 opening. And we need you to be part of this museum. We want you as visitors. We want you as guides. We want you as thought partners with us as we're getting down this final stretch. What objects do we have to have in this museum to help tell your story? This is intended to be a reflection of the whole community, and it's hard to do without people kind of helping us shape the story. And so for the teen council, it's been amazing to get you guys thinking with us about what this museum can be and do. And I just hope we get lots of your colleagues, your teammates, your friends involved, because that will make a community museum really come alive. So I can't wait to let you join us.
Well, thank you so much, Miss Blond, for coming in today. It was great having you.
Thanks, I really appreciate it. Please, like, anyone reach out, check us out on our website, capitaljewishmuseum.org, send us emails, connect with us on social media. We would just love to have you be part of this. So thanks.
Well, thank you. Bye.